So the theme of this talk is from how to learn to what to learn in multi-agent systems and robotics. I'm first going to introduce myself briefly. At UT Austin, there's some really exciting times. I was the founding director of Texas Robotics, where we took a lot of inspiration from Chad and his group at the University of Michigan. Have taken a slightly different path, but we have now 18 core faculty, and we're going to host the Coral Conference in 2026. So I hope many of you will come there. We have a beautiful facility full of robots that used to be a gymnasium. We got one of the first NSF AI institutes, the Institute for Foundations of Machine Learning, that's led by Adam Clivens. We have a campus-wide ethical AI initiative called Good Systems, which is inspired in many ways by the 100-year study on artificial intelligence, which I've been a part of for many years, and which is scheduled to have a new study panel report released in the coming months, sometime this year. So I hope people will be looking forward to that. And UT Austin has really been a leader, I'm proud of this, in AI education. We've been created a broadly accessible AI literacy course for humanities and music majors for everybody on our campus. There's going to be a talk on that at EAAI on Saturday. And we also have launched an online master's in artificial intelligence where people can get a master's degree from around the world for a total cost of $10,000. So over my career, I've done a lot of different things, but the unifying sort of inspiring research question for me has been this one: to what degree can autonomous intelligent agents learn in the presence of teammates and or adversaries in real-time dynamic domains? And so my group has published in the main AI conferences, but also in sort of more specialized areas shown here. And in this talk, I'm going to especially emphasize our work on multi-agent systems and robotics, and in particular reinforcement learning as a machine learning method. We do both algorithmic and theoretical contributions in research, but also a lot of use-inspired research that's motivated by particular problems. And so when I give a one-slide introduction to my lab like this one, it's a lot easier to give you a sense of the problems that have inspired me. So as Rajat said in the introduction, I've been a leader in the RoboCup community. I was president of RoboCup until not too long ago. This is what the robots look like or used to look like, and these are the now robots. This is a game from more than 10 years ago. Our team was the robots with their hands behind their back, which we did so they wouldn't bump into other robots as much. But you have to remember, these are fully autonomous. They're sensing, decide, and acting on their own. They're autonomous agents. Here you see our robot going in on a breakaway. And we ended up that year winning the competition. So this was the first goal in it. We were playing against a team from the University of Bremen in Germany, which has been one of the best in this competition for years, but we beat them that particular year. And so I said that was a long time ago, more than 10 years ago. Just a few months ago, at the most recent RoboCup, we had the first game of humanoid robots against people on the same soccer field. And it wasn't very interesting when we just had people against the robots. So after a few minutes, I switched to the team with the robots. And I'm going to show you a clip here that I thought was incredibly impressive what the robot did. This could never have happened, I think, a year ago. And I didn't know what the robot was going to do. But here you'll see me starting with the ball. And I move the ball to right in front of this robot. It turns around and kicks the ball between the legs of Ubo Visser. And there's Joydeep Biswas there as well. And so we're finally at this moment where it actually makes sense, or it's starting to make sense to have humanoid robots and people on the same soccer field. And the goal of RoboCup is by the year 2050 to have a team of humanoid robots that can beat the best World Cup champion on a real soccer field. And that's one of the sort of inspirational goals of RoboCup, and that's driven a lot of the inspiration in my lab as well. RoboCup isn't just about soccer. There's also a general purpose service robot competition called RoboCup at Home. So here you see the robot acting as a party host, and here you see it putting away dishes or putting away groceries, and then after this, you'll see it setting the table for breakfast and actually pouring the cereal into the bowl. So these are the kinds of tasks that the robot has to do fully autonomously. And it's a fantastic domain for people who are interested in trying to create autonomous robots in sort of this service setting. Like many people, I've also been very inspired by autonomous driving as a challenge problem. I had a car in the DARPA Urban Challenge in 2007 and have thought a lot about what the world would look like when all the cars on the road are autonomous. Would we still need traffic signals and stop signs, or could we have intersections that look like this? I think this is going to become feasible and will be much more efficient as a way to get cars through intersections. This is a multi-agent protocol where the cars that are white have called ahead for a reservation through the intersection, and the ones that are yellow don't have a reservation yet, so they need to stop. But once they turn white, they have a guaranteed path through the intersection that won't collide with other cars. And so that was actually, we first did that about 20 years ago, and we've done, I've done 2 decades of research on how this would expand to humans and autonomous cars on the road together, or pedestrians and bicyclists, or multiple intersections. And I could give a 1-hour talk on just that. More recently in the autonomous driving scenario, my team at Sony AI created an agent called GT Sophie that outraces the very best human drivers in a very high fidelity simulation called Gran Turismo. This is what it looks like. So the colored car is GT Sophie. The white cars are driven by people. And it's an end-to-end reinforcement learning agent that has learned things like, this is a skill where it's learned a defensive skill to try to not just drive the fastest way around the track, but to drive in a way that it's difficult to pass. So I'll show you that one more time. And again, this was learned just through end-to-end reinforcement learning. And I was told that if you really want to have impact with your AI research, you should get someone with a British accent to narrate the videos. It has a lot more impact that way. And another domain that I think is going to be really challenging for robotics in coming into the future, and that's inspired a lot of our research, is social navigation. Robots navigating in the same space as people, maybe even through crowds. And so this is joint work with Joydeep Biswas, where we've had robots that have learned how to navigate through sort of open, unstructured space, which is in many ways, more difficult than driving on a road where there's lanes and traffic laws. Just have to sort of move around people and recognize where they're going. And so I think these are all incredibly inspiring domains. I'm not going to talk that much more in this talk about GT Sophie, but there will be a talk at AAAI. In the competition that was featured on the cover of Nature, we learned a separate policy for each car and track. But in a paper that's going to appear right after my talk on Friday in AAAI, there'll be a talk by Graham Bruton on a single policy that can generalize to drive more than 500 cars in GT7 without any access to sort of context or information about the details of the cars. So I encourage you to go see that talk if you do come to AAAI. Okay, so coming back to the theme of this talk, I think there's a lot of focus right now in the AI community on how to learn. And I think this is very important work, don't get me wrong, but I think right now it's being overrepresented in some ways. And what I mean by how to learn is algorithms, neural net algorithms for such as transformers, state space models, or diffusion, reinforcement learning algorithms. There's many that are out there. And then I think there's sort of most of the people, or many people in the field, are doing research that can be categorized into sort of 4 different categories. There's the algorithms. Then there's people who are doing what I call neural net psychology. They're trying to understand under what conditions these neural networks will succeed or fail. What can they do, what they can't do. Or neural net neuroscience, where people are looking into the activations of when do particular nodes in the neural network get activated. Or neural net applications, what are they good for. And again, I think this is all really important research that we should be doing as a community. But I'm going to give 2 pieces of advice in this talk for especially the students in the audience. And the first piece of advice is be different. So it's great that this research is happening, but there's so much more that is underrepresented. And the best way to make a name for yourself is to try to work in an area that's a little bit less crowded. And so you'll notice that all of this research is about neural nets. There is a lot more to AI than neural networks. Let's remember that. From the past and that are still important. There's there's symbolic reasoning, there's probabilistic reasoning, there's ways to combine these different paradigms, and maybe there's still new paradigms that we haven't discovered yet. And so I think we need more representation in that throughout the community. And then, as I'm going to emphasize in this talk, I think there ought to be more focus on not just how to learn, but also what to learn. And I take as inspiration for this is babies, human babies, and some fantastic research by a collaborator of mine, Karen Adolph at NYU. And she sort of recognized that many people in the psychology community have sort of asked babies to do particular tasks, learn how to walk straight. And they say, we're going to study how babies learn to walk by getting them to walk straight over and over again. And so we'll entice them to walk straight by waving things in front of them. We'll track their feet. But in practice, what Karen recognized is that you're not really going to learn how babies learn by you deciding what they learn and then just studying how they learn. In practice, babies decide for themselves what they're going to do when they're learning. They walk all over the place. They don't just walk straight. They walk in curves. They fall over. They decide what they're going to pay attention to, the stroller sometimes. A lot of what they're doing is not just figuring out how to learn, but they're choosing actively what to learn. And so there's a direct connection to robotics in this. I have a paper with Karen and her group on walking and falling using robot simulations to model the role of errors in infant walking that was published in Developmental Science, where we sort of took the paths that babies use when they're learning and used them to be the paths that robots would use when they're learning to walk, and found that it was much more effective than having also the robots just walk straight ahead. And so we document that in that paper. So this talk is now going to be organized into sort of 4 opportunities that I see for identifying what to learn and situations where it's really important for us to pick what to learn. So sometimes the task that you have or that the agent has is too difficult to learn in one shot, or the world is too big. And in fact, instead, the agent needs to decide for itself how to learn subtasks along the way. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Another situation is when the tasks that the agent's going to need to do in the future are unknown. So it has some experience now. It has to figure out what to learn that's going to set it up for those future tasks. Another situation is when there's other agents in the environment, and you have to figure out with whom to learn or what types of collaborators or adversaries to learn against to prepare you for a multi-agent environment. And the last setting is when there are humans to learn from that are reacting to the agent, and you have to figure out what to learn from those human reactions. So what I'm going to do is, and I've realized that a lot of the work that I've done in the past in my lab can sort of fall into these different categories. I won't claim at all that I'm the only one working on any of these problems. I think there's rich work in the community. But I found it useful to sort of try to categorize the work that I've been doing into these different buckets. I have a lot more that I could talk about, so I'm going to tell you just a little bit about a lot of things, and I'm going to pick 1 or 2 things to go in a little bit more detail. So it's going to be a talk where there's sort of lots of little vignettes and then a little technical detail on just 1 or 2 topics. Okay, so diving in on this first subtopic here is what subtasks, and when the world is, the task is difficult or the world is big. So you could learn from, when the difficult tasks, you have to figure out which subtasks to learn. And this is built on a rich history of task simplification, where there's transfer learning algorithms and task decomposition. We want to go beyond those, where these were sort of manually created, to automatic curriculum learning that I'll talk about. And then sometimes there's an opportunity to figure out what occurrences in the environment to learn about, and I'll talk about a method briefly called event tables. And then there's also opportunities to learn to figure out what not to learn. So I'll start by the work of Matt Taylor, one of the program chairs with Chad of AAAI this year. His thesis from around 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, was introducing transfer learning for reinforcement learning. And he had some really nice results in a robot soccer simulation. Here's like 4 red agents trying to keep the ball away from 3 blue agents, where that task was too difficult to learn all at once. And so he had them first learn in a smaller 3 versus 2 scenario, which is, and then transfer that to the 4 versus 3 scenario. And so here's if it just tries to learn 4 versus 3 all by itself, but if it spends a little bit of time learning that simpler task first, it could then do better. And then my own thesis introduced a method for task decomposition called layered learning that was then really expanded by Patrick McAlpine in a different robot soccer simulator, where he took 19 different behaviors and put them together to create a really competent agent that ended up winning the RoboCup competition dramatically over several years. In this one particular year, you saw the results there, and it had learned skills like walking and kicking and positioning, where each one was learned sort of individually, and then they were put together. But in both transfer learning and layered learning, the subtasks were chosen manually by a person. And so that inspired the thesis of Sanmeet Narvekar on automated curriculum learning, and then future work, follow-up work by Zifan Xu, which I'll give a little more detail on, that's inspired by the idea that people learn via curriculum. When you go to school, there's a teacher giving you a curriculum to learn from. And a curriculum sort of consists of 3 things: the subtasks that a teacher can choose from, the choice of how to sequence those tasks, what to learn first and what next, and then the transfer learning from what you learn in the simpler task as it gets transferred to the later task. And there's an inspiring game called Quick Chess that does this for children learning chess, that sort of introduces one piece at a time before getting to the full game. And so we can think of this as sort of the goal being trying to learn a teacher agent that can automatically figure out what's the next task a student should learn. And so in Zifan's work, he noticed that sort of curriculum learning, sort of as in the vanilla form, would be given a target task. Say the robot has to get from this red dot to the green dot. You might imagine a curriculum where it first learns to get just a small part of the way, and then you back it up until it can do the full task. Automated curriculum is trying to learn a sort of a meta curriculum, a teacher that's good at teaching any task, so that if you have different target tasks here, it can figure out what's the next subtask that the agent should learn and do that automatically. And the insight is that it shouldn't be a fixed curriculum, but rather it should be dependent on what the agent has learned so far. Right? You should take a look at what the agent's current competency is, and based on that, figure out what it needs to learn next. And so to do that, we introduce a notion. We formulate the problem as follows: we take a underspecified domain, an MDP, that's parameterized by some vector. And then the current competency of the student is represented by how well it can do the target task, the original, the task you're aiming at, with its current parameters or its current state of knowledge. So we evaluate what's its return. What's its return if you take the current student on this current on the current task, and then the teacher wants to estimate for all the different next subtasks I could give you, which is going to, if you learn on it next and then transfer, which is going to improve the student's performance as much as possible on the target task. And so we're not going to just do that, but we don't want to just do that for a fixed target task. We want to do that for a distribution of target tasks so that the teacher agent gets good at teaching in general. And so we introduced an LSTM, a recurrent neural network way of doing this, where the contextual information contains all of the training histories. So how much training on a subtask improved the target performance, and then the teacher model takes the student skill as input, represented as the current target task behavior. And so we have a pair of if I gave it this task from its current state, here's how much it improved. And so after learning that, we found that it was able to, on a couple of very challenging domains, we have a metric called iterations to threshold, which means how long does it take to get to some threshold performance on the target task. And we found that using our meta automated curriculum learning, it gets there much more quickly than any of the existing state-of-the-art methods for automated curriculum learning. So another way we can learn if the task is very difficult is using event tables. This was actually something that was inspired by our GT Sophie work. So these are some of my colleagues at Sony AI, and we noticed that when you try to create this agent that's going to be superhuman at autonomous driving, you can't just have it learn from scratch from random trajectories, but you rather need to allow it to focus on the important, sort of the important aspects of the environment, such as when there's a car right in front of you, or there's 2 cars in front of you, or 3 or 4, or specific parts of the task. And for those of you who know how RL works, we were using a soft actor critic method, so an offline method where there's an experience replay buffer, and it turned out that it was really, really important to choose the experiences that would go into that buffer as a function of different location on the track, using a method that we call event tables, which we also then in a NURIPS paper generalized to show that it worked also in a robot control task in Majoko, and a more simulated task as well. Or a more simpler simulated task as well. And then finally in this segment of the talk, the thesis of Todd Hester recognized that in a big world, and by a big world what I mean is a world that's larger than the length of time that an agent has to explore exhaustively. So in a lot of traditional reinforcement learning, you assume that the agent can at least try everything once, and then you figure out, then it has to optimize among all the things it's tried. But as people, we live in a world that's too big to explore exhaustively, right? I can't visit every city in the world in my lifetime. I can't even try every restaurant in the city that I live in, right? I have to actively figure out where I'm never going to explore. And so this was the insight in an algorithm called TEXplore for targeted exploration, where the agent chooses where not to explore. And we use this for autonomous driving, to learn a speed controller on our autonomous car that was in the DARPA Urban Challenge, shown here. And the main result was that it could learn to do as well as a tuned PID controller in about 3 minutes of driving, because it was actively figuring out what things it was never going to try. Like, you don't have to try flooring the accelerator ever. That's not going to teach it anything. Or slamming on the brakes. It was trying to get to 30 miles an hour, and so there were sort of areas of the action space that it learned to explore. Okay, so that's the first segment of this talk. When the agent's task is too hard or the world is too big, you might want to try automated curriculum learning, or event tables, or TEXplore to try to figure out what never to learn. So moving on to the next segment, sometimes the agent's future tasks are unknown. And this is becoming an area of increasing importance. And so, as I say, that's sort of also like a baby in a crib. We give it sort of the ability to explore around, but it doesn't yet know what jobs it's going to need to do in the rest of the baby's life, right? There's this sort of exploration phase that's not tied to a specific task. And so in this kind of setting, we've done work on causal reinforcement learning for learning state dependencies, trying to automate learning of an action space, where I'm going to go do pretty much a pretty deep technical dive on how we do this, a new algorithm called SLAC. It's also sort of the paradigm of continual or lifelong learning. And there's also some work that I'm going to go a little bit into detail on what's becoming known as unsupervised reinforcement learning, where there's a pre-training phase. Okay, so going through those. First, the notion of causal reinforcement learning, the thesis work of my current students, Zizhuao and Zifan. We've introduced a few algorithms for causal dynamics learning, where you're learning a task-independent state abstraction by figuring out which actions cause which state variables to change, and then if you want to try to change a state variable, you then can sort of factor out particular actions. And similarly, Zhang, who has worked on an algorithm called causal policy gradient. And then I'll just tell you briefly about an algorithm called Eldon that explores to discover local dependencies among state variables. So what do I mean by that? And this is a work from NURIPS 2 years ago, where Zizhuao and Zhang were the co-first authors, and Roberto Martin is co-advisor. Where the motivation is that sometimes you have some what we call hard exploration problems, which means that there's sparse reward and a long horizon. So for example, if the task is to cook a meatball on a stove, there's some things you need to do. You need to put the meatball into a pot. You need to get the pot onto the stove. You need to turn the switch. And if you just explore randomly, you're not going to find even once the sequence of actions that would give you a reward, right? Because this reward is sparse and it's a long horizon. This is just an example. And And so the solution here is that we want to try to come up with an intrinsic reward that guides the agent without any additional reward signal. And so the sparse reward that we use is trying to come up with states and actions that change, that create novel dependencies between entities in the environment. So first, the agent will explore how its actions change its own state. Right? If I move this joint, it changes, sort of whether the robot's arm is open or closed. And then once it knows how it affects itself, it can learn how the robot affects the pot. So, for example, that if it's touching the pot or grasping the pot, then when it moves its arm, the pot also moves. So that's a local dependency. If it's not grasping the pot and it moves its arm, the pot doesn't move. So it needs to learn that this sort of local contact will make it so that these two state variables are connected to one another. And furthermore, that if the meatball is in the pot, that if it moves its arm while it's holding the pot, the meatball will also move. Right? So that's now also a local dependency. And then finally, it can learn that if it gets the pot onto the stove, if it gets the pot onto the stove, it will cook it'll cook the meatball, but only if it's in the pot and the pot is on the stove. Right? And so these are, each of these are sort of learning the interactions between the robot's actions and the dependencies between the different state variables. And that becomes a good heuristic for figuring out where to plan to in the environment to see if you can move eventually towards a sparse reward. The first area that I'm going to go into a much deeper technical dive is some work that I'm really excited about. Called Simulated Pre-trained Latent Action Space, or SLAC. This just appeared in the Coral conference a couple months ago. It's the first author of this is Zhang Hu, and this is again doing some pre-learning for downstream tasks, and in particular, it's trying to learn an action space. So. And it's motivated by the idea of trying to learn a visual-motor, contact-rich, whole-body mobile manipulation policy for any number of robots via real-world reinforcement learning without any demonstrations. So a lot of learning in the real world on robots these days relies on either learning all in simulation and hoping that'll transfer to the real world, or getting demonstrations of people or other robots doing the task and mimicking them. We're going to do neither of those. On tasks like this, where the robot has to sort of figure out how to wipe the whiteboard while also navigating around obstacles like this trash bin. So there's sort of a multi-dimensional action space. It also has to control its camera so that it can see the things that it's trying to wipe. So it has to move its arm, its base, its camera all together. And we want to do this with real-world RL, like I said, because it can be really hard to build high enough fidelity simulators that you get zero-shot sim to real. It can be very costly to collect high-quality demonstrations. So we want to try to directly learn from real-world interactions without either of those. And so existing reinforcement learning methods, if you tell them to just learn to wipe the blue mark, they're going to just sort of motor babble. Right? They're going to move their arm around, and they're never going to get that reward signal. It's sort of the same idea of there's a sparse reward, and it's not going to be able to make much progress. And so our insight was that, oops, how do I get this to go to the next slide? There. And so the challenge is, how can we overcome the sample efficiency and safety concerns when doing real-world RL on complex robot embodiments like this? And the key insight is that you need a really good action space, so that it's lower dimensional, there's fewer things to try, and it can facilitate both sample efficiency and safety. And so how are we going to get this sort of effective action space? We're going to use a low-fidelity simulator that's not nearly good enough to do zero-shot sim-to-real transfer, but is good enough to figure out what are the action dimensions that the robot should be considering. So it's going to start with this original high-dimensional action space in a low-fidelity simulation, do unsupervised action learning, so it doesn't yet know what its task is going to be, and then it'll learn a very structured, efficient action space that it can then use to learn multiple real-world tasks downstream. So here's sort of a low-fidelity simulation, a picture of it for that real robot that I just showed you. And so we're going to learn, like I say, task-agnostic behaviors in this low-fidelity simulator. We're going to start by learning a latent action space that's low dimensional, and that allows us to do temporally extended whole body motions that will be diverse. Right? So if it tries one action, it'll do one thing. If it tries another, it'll do something very different. It should allow it to explore the action space efficiently. There had been previous methods for doing this, learning sort of a low-dimensional, latent action space. What we introduced was a method called disentangled unsupervised skill discovery, or DUSTI, that was in NeurIPS 24, that also enforces that the latent action space that's learned is disentangled, meaning that if you change one dimension, it will only change one dimension of the robot. So like, there would be one dimension for moving the base of the robot, or maybe a couple for moving the base, another dimension for moving the camera, another for moving the arm. And that wasn't the case in existing methods. They would be more entangled. We then also add the notion of being able to add a safety reward that penalizes self-collisions or driving off a cliff or something like that. And so with using this method, DUSTI, we then learn this low-dimensional latent action space in the low-fidelity simulator. And it learns sort of disentangled features, like the red controls the camera, the blue controls the arm, the green dimensions control the base. And so we can create a sort of a skill empowerment reward that rewards the robot for finding these actions that allow it to affect the environment or change its state in efficient ways. And then we can add the safety reward for things like self-collision and things like that, or collision with obstacles. And so that's how we train this low-dimensional latent action space. And then in the second phase, we can then use this to learn downstream tasks in the real world, not in the low-fidelity simulator. And so we developed a factorized version of Soft Actor Critic that leverages the structure of this latent action space, where the insight is that now that we have, if we have a task that has multiple reward dimensions, some rewards that are just based on moving the base, some based on the camera, some based on the arm, that we don't need to have a fully connected graph between the action dimensions and the reward components. Instead, we can learn a sparser space that allows us for more accurate and efficient reinforcement learning training. And we learn these dependencies through causal skill discovery. So basically a conditional mutual information model that recognizes when you take an action, which reward component changes over time. And so then you can learn a matrix that says, when I want to try to influence one particular reward term, here are the actions I should try. When I want to take another one, it's here are the other actions I should try. And all this data can then be used for initializing the robot's replay buffer. So then when it does downstream task learning, it takes this frozen, pre-learned latent action space and learns the policy for the particular task based on the various components of the robot, and assuming that there's this sort of decomposed reward signal based on where it's looking, what the arm's doing, what the base is doing. And using this learned causal matrix that I talked about in the previous slide. So the end result is, here's at the start of training, the robot's now not just motor babbling, it's sort of exploring in a much more sort of effective way. This is before it's actually learned anything. This latent action space enables the fast exploration. And the robot can then, for 40 minutes of training, get to a behavior that is now able to wipe the letters off of the whiteboard. And again, importantly, all of the training was done in the real world using this lower dimensional action space. And then it can also, that same learned action space can then be used for other tasks, like pushing garbage onto a tray, or sweeping the garbage into a bag. So same robot, same low dimensional action space, different downstream tasks. And compared to doing zero-shot sim-to-real transfer or other methods for real-world reinforcement learning, we have a much higher success rate, fewer safety violations, and all of the policies trained in less than 1 hour. So more details of that you can find online on our Coral paper recently. Okay, and then there is a whole area, like I said, and continual learning and lifelong learning. We've done some work on. I actually had a startup company called Cogitai that was devoted to this. And then another sort of technical deep dive that I'll do is or a little bit of a deep dive is on unsupervised reinforcement learning, which also, like Slack, has this pre-training phase that is leveraged. So the idea is that you have a robot, you have the opportunity for environment interactions, and then you can sort of learn about the world, and that's in your sort of pre-training phase. And then you can take what you've learned about the world when you're eventually given a reward function and figure out what policy corresponds to that reward function. And that's sort of the inference phase in unsupervised reinforcement learning. And so in a paper from ICML this past year with Siddhant and Harshit, co-advised with Amy Zhang, we introduced a method called proto-successor measure for doing this pre-training phase. And a successor measure, briefly, is a measure over the future states an agent will visit when executing a given policy from a particular state. So there's a measure that's learned if you're in state S and you take action A, how often will you visit another particular state downstream if you execute that policy over a long period of time? And so that's completely independent of a reward function. It's just what are the dynamics of the world. And then there's the reward-based phase where you're given a reward function and you want to find the distribution of states you want to visit for that reward function. And the observation of this paper is first that this successor measure gives reward-independent representation in the reward-free phase, and then very quick linear optimization for objective for policy optimization. And in particular, what we show in this paper is that the space of all policies that are optimal for some reward function is an affine space. And so once you're given a reward function, you can almost just look up what's the policy from this affine space that corresponds to the optimal policy for that reward function. And so I think this is a really powerful insight. And we were then able to incorporate this into a system called RL0 that incorporates language into zero-shot RL, where there's three phases: an imagine phase, a project phase, and an imitate phase, which I'll go into detail on, or in a high-level overview. You can imagine, you give the string a person doing yoga, you take an existing visual language model and create a sequence of what it looks like for a person to be doing that. That's sort of imagining what this string corresponds to with this pre-trained video foundation model. Then you project in your current domain what a robot should look like if it's trying to mimic that sequence of states. It needs to be projected because the robot might not be able to get those same poses as the person, so you have to find sort of a similarity-based sequence that looks like what was imagined. And then you use these proto-successor measures to find the policy that matches the same distribution of states from what you imagined, and use that policy in the real world. So you're trying to learn the policy whose occupancy matches the target distribution. And so, for instance, if we give the text string cartwheel or crawl like a worm or bunny hop or jump high, we're able to learn, just look up sort of policies that sort of maximize the reward. And even further, we found that we can even skip this imagine step, which allows for cross-embodiment imitation by taking videos from YouTube. So we can just have these agents mimic the videos or the poses that the person did, and this is sort of using that project step. And this is some videos of that working. Okay, so that's the end of this segment of the talk. Sometimes the agent's future tasks are unknown. And so I told you about a bunch of things there: causal reinforcement learning for learning state dependencies, Slack for learning in action space, continual learning I just touched on, but there's a nice body of work on continual lifelong learning where the tasks come in over time, and then this unsupervised RL where there's a pre-training phase that you can leverage. So in the next segment, I'm going to move to the multi-agent setting, as advertised in the title of the talk. Sometimes there are other agents in the environment. And an important question becomes, with whom should you learn? Who should be your sparring partners or your training partners? And for that, we've done some really I think, interesting work on open-ended ad hoc teamwork. So what do I mean by that? What's ad hoc teamwork, first of all? This is an area that I've been fascinated by for the past 15 years or so, where the idea is to create a team player or an individual that can collaborate with unknown teammates, ones that are programmed by others, say. And those teammates are likely to be suboptimal. In particular, we have no control over what they're going to be like. And so people are very good at this, right? I can go play a pickup game of soccer in any country around the world. I may not be able to talk with the people. I may not be able to... I've never seen them before, but I can figure out how to fit into the game. People are good at, if there's a disaster rescue scenario, figuring out how they can work together with strangers. But robots typically have not been able to do that. And so the challenge of ad hoc teamwork is to create a good team player. Katie Genter and Sam Barrett had some of the first PhD theses in this space. I've collaborated also with Stefano Albrecht, Noah Agman, and several people afterwards. On this challenge of creating a good team player. It was actually introduced as a challenge problem at AAAI in 2010. So, I guess 16 years ago now. There's been theory on it and experiments in various domains, like the pursuit domain, where the yellow agent here is the ad hoc team player, and it has to figure out how to cooperate to capture a prey with a bunch of pre-existing teammates. Or you can do that in robot soccer, where you put this green agent on the yellow team, and it has to figure out how to work with its current teammates. And so what we've been looking at now is how do you choose the teammates you want to practice with to become a good ad hoc team player? And so this is joint work with Caroline Wong and Arash Rahman. I think Arash is going to be giving a talk here in a week or two. He's doing fantastic work and really a driver behind this research. And also Yoon and Jashun. And so this is a paper called Rotate, Regret-Driven Open-Ended Training in Ad Hoc Teamwork. Existing ad hoc teamwork methods typically break the problem into two phases. First, picking the teammates that you're going to train with or learn with, and then learn how to cooperate with them. And then hope that when you're given new teammates, they're close enough to the ones you trained with that you can work with them well. And so it can be really difficult to figure out what should that set of teammates that you want to train against be. So it can be challenging to specify how many to generate and also how they would influence ego agent learning. So what we introduced recently is a method called Rotate that it frames ad hoc teamwork as an open-ended interactive learning process between a teammate generator and a learning agent. Where so it's sort of this iterative. It doesn't first do teammate generation and then learning, but it figures out which teammate to generate next based on what the agent has currently knows. And so it uses a really nice theoretical framework called cooperative regret. It's trying to maximize cooperative regret, where it's basically identifying a teammate with whom it's possible to collaborate well. So they're good at the task. There is an agent that would cooperate well with them, but our current the current learning agent doesn't cooperate well with them. Right? So it doesn't make sense to train with an agent who it's impossible to work with, who's not even good at the task. It also doesn't make sense to train with one that you already know how to cooperate with. You need to find the ones that it's possible to cooperate with, but you're not good at yet. And so this becomes sort of an iterative closed-loop process. And so there's a teammate generator. Then you find the best response to your current teammates. You find the teammates who you're not good, who you have high cooperative regret with, and you do this over several different learning iterations to learn your eventual ad hoc teamwork agent. We show this as a chef because our main testbed domain is in the domain of overcooked, but we also use another domain called level-based foraging. And across all of these domains, we find that, first of all, it's dramatically better than an adversarial robust agent, the Minimax agent, that's just trying to do the best in the worst case. Instead, it's able to train against unseen teammates, or to perform well with unseen teammates, and it rotates the blue line. It does much better than any of the other approaches in general, and it's very consistent. It does well. This graph shows that that rotate in purple does well with many, many different possible teammates, whereas other approaches tend to specialize. They're good with some teammates, but they're not good with others. Okay. So that's the third segment of this talk. Sometimes there are other agents in the environment. And finally, I'm going to talk about what if there's humans in the environment that are reacting to the agent as it's learning. And I'll talk about, there's some work in my lab on learning from evaluative feedback, on learning various input types, from various input types, and then also even learning from implicit feedback, where the person is not explicitly giving feedback to the agent. I'm just going to touch briefly on this, because I think this is an area where I think there's still a lot of opportunity for doing more what to learn kinds of things. So first, Tamer was introduced by Brad Knox in his thesis and followed up by Garrett Warnell. What to learn from evaluative feedback. It's teaching an agent from manual reinforcement. The initial testbed domain for this was Tetris, which you may be familiar with, where what's going on here is an agent starting out randomly placing blocks, but a person is saying good move, and it flashes green, or bad move, it flashes red. And even during the first episode, the agent starts placing the blocks intelligently, doing better than random. And as it's doing, this was a domain that at the time you could learn using reinforcement learning, but it would take hundreds and thousands of games to start doing well. And here you see it's already doing well in the first game, and after just 3 games, not hundreds of thousands of games, it's able to learn a very competent policy that's able to clear hundreds of lines. So it's doing, again, this is just 3 games in, and really leveraging that human reward signal. And we found that Tamer learns very dramatically more quickly than the autonomous learning algorithms, but not as well asymptotically. And so Brad then also introduced Tamer plus RL, which learns from both human feedback and then also can learn autonomously and sort of mix them together, get the best of both worlds, so learn quickly and effectively in the limit. With Garrett extended this to a system called Deep Tamer to video input. And I think Brad's thesis legitimately was the first to introduce what's now become known as reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF, which, as many of you know, has played a big role in sort of the success of large language models. More recently, with Shuisu Zhao, who's now faculty at George Mason, was a postdoc in my lab, we were looking at a method called adaptive planner parameter learning for learning navigation in highly constrained spaces. So instead of like a robot moving where there's not very much room, what if the robot has to get through spaces that are barely bigger than the robot? And rather than trying to learn end-to-end from sensors from pixels to torques, it took existing learning methods and then tried to treat that, a navigation method, and treat it as a black box where what we need to just do is find the parameters to make this ROS package work well in practice. And so in sort of a machine learning way of looking at this, rather than learning a policy from pixels to torques where you have the actions are raw actions and the states are raw states. Instead, the actions are parameters to a classical motion planner, and then we learn a parameter policy that will control the agent. And so we did this where the person can give lots of different types of input. It could give demonstrations or corrective interventions where the person just says, you're doing fine most of the time, but I'm going to step in when the robot's not doing very well, or evaluative feedback, which is just like Tamer, good move or bad move, or reinforcement learning, and show that it can be that we can learn effectively from humans to optimize the parameters of the navigation agent by just changing, based on the type of human input, how we learn this parameter policy. I'm not going to go into the technical details here, but the papers and videos are online. And I think the real impact of this is to be able to not just learn from a specific type of human interaction, but to be able to learn from whatever the person happens to be giving you. If the person's giving demonstrations, use it. If they're giving interventions or evaluative feedback, use it. And then maybe even go offline and do some reinforcement learning overnight while the person's sleeping and tune for their own house. And so we sort of this concept of a cycle of learning Shuisu introduced, and I think is very much in the spirit of trying to figure out what to learn. And then finally, as I said, you might even learn when the person isn't trying to give feedback, but rather you have implicit cues. And so if you're an autonomous car and your passengers look like this, you probably don't need them to tell you you're doing something wrong, right? You can figure out that you need to improve your performance. So we introduced a method called evaluative mapping for effective task learning via human implicit cues for the problem of learning from implicit feedback, where there's first a phase of trying to figure out, based on the way a person's face or body language is looking, whether they're pleased or displeased. and then based on what tasks where you know what good performance is, and then you can take that to tasks where you don't know what good performance is and use their implicit feedback as if it were an explicit signal in in something like the tamer system. Okay, so that concludes this sort of 4-part breakdown of the talk, where you can learn, in this case, from evaluative feedback, various types of input or implicit feedback. And overall, I talked about these 4 different methods: learning when the task is too hard or the world too big, that when the future tasks are unknown, when there's multiple agents in the environment, or when there's humans to give input. Again, I'll tie this back and remind you that it all ties back into the research question that I introduced at the beginning of the talk. And I'm just going to close by giving the second piece of advice. I promised that I'd give 2 pieces of advice in this talk. Recall that at the beginning of the talk I said, be different. Don't just follow jump on the bandwagon and do what everybody else is doing. The other piece of advice in today's day and age, I think it's really important to be considering the societal implications of your work. That AI really is making a difference. AI systems are making a big difference these days. I already mentioned the 100-year study on artificial intelligence, where there's going to be the next study panel report coming out in a few months. I was happy to create a course on ethical AI and robotics, where all of the systems, all of the materials are online from my webpage. Recently, we published a paper on the harmful traits of AI companions, where Brad Knox is the first author, but we collaborated with a very interdisciplinary team to look at the sort of impacts of AI companions on society and on people. And then finally, my team at Sony AI has recently had a paper on the cover of Nature, just a couple of weeks ago, actually, on a fair human-centric image benchmark, and I'll show you a brief video about that.
Ethical issues with computer vision start at the data layer.
And that data is not collected in an ethical and responsible way. The internet is burden.
Nope, the video is not working very well. Okay, I'm going to stop the video and just tell you about it, or at least try to. So Phoebe is a...
Ethical data collection turns out to be
here we go.
an extremely challenging issue. It's one of those things that we think this should be that difficult.
Okay, I don't know why that's happening, so let me kill the video and just tell you that it's that the key to this is that it's a data set that has more than 10,000 images, so it's not enough to train, but it is enough to evaluate large language models. It has subjects from 81 countries and areas where all of the labels are self-generated, so it's not somebody looking at you and saying what type of person you are. It's people saying for themselves what their labels should be, and you can always revoke permission to be in this data set. And it's used in the Nature paper to show that we can do much deeper bias analyses on existing models than have been possible before. Okay, so with that, I'll acknowledge that this talk is the result of many my current and past students in the Learning Agents Research Group, my colleagues at Sony AI, many different sponsors from government funding agencies, private companies, and with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
So unfortunately, we're totally out of time, so I'm sort of told to not take any questions. So maybe one question. Do you have... I see a...
Oh, hi, I'm John. I'm very pleased to hear your talk. Actually, I played the Gran Turismo before, and I got trashed by the AI. I think it's the AI you created with Sony. So it's really good. I just wanted to ask, a lot of reinforcement learning is based on the reward, and it seems like if you want to do like arbitrary tasks and goals, the reward signal can be quite hard to obtain. Like for example, the Slack paper you talked about, like how do you know when the blue mark is cleared? So I just want to ask, like, have you tried methods where like maybe you use the general knowledge of LLMs, like the Imagine paper just now, to maybe define the reward and then use that to train the robot, maybe that's better? Or is there a way to do like goal-directed learning? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the reward engineering is challenging, and there's multiple different ways to approach that. One is to develop algorithms that learn from sparse reward, where you just give the end goal of the task that you're striving for, and use the intrinsic motivation to try to get there, like in the Eldon system that I talked about, and causal reinforcement learning kinds of things. The other is to come up with a complex factored reward signal, and there's many approaches for doing that. So using LLMs to try to come up with good reward signals is one approach. Often there's a sort of an iterative human process for doing that. So we've looked at many different ways for generating the reward signal, and yes, that is a key to making reinforcement learning work. So it's a good point.
Okay, thanks. Let's thank Peter for taking the time out of coming to NUS. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks.